Have you been asked to find some missing amounts using the contribution margin ratios and you're not quite sure what to do? Well, you've come to the right place because I'm Professor Capko and I'm going to show you just how easy it is to do that in today's video. But first, I want to say I believe something wonderful is just about to happen for you, so be on the lookout for it. And now, back to the video. I did a prior video in which I had a chart similar to this one in which various missing numbers were completed. We completed those numbers using contribution margin, the overall contribution margin. But in this one, we're going to use contribution margin ratio. If you didn't see that prior video, I've linked it up here for you to take a look at. In this one, as I mentioned, we're going to look at the contribution margin ratio, which is usually expressed as a percentage. And we're going to use that to fill in the amounts that are missing in our chart. So let's take it one firm at a time. In the first firm, we have sales of $323,000. We don't know the variable costs. Now remember, variable costs is the costs that relate directly to the production of the units or the sales of the units. So that will vary directly with the amount of sales. And this is not a variable cost per unit. This is overall variable costs for the time period. So in the time period that the sales were made, what are the variable costs in total? Then we have contribution margin ratio of 32%. That means of the sales, 32% of it goes toward our operating income. So 32% is our contribution margin ratio for firm A. We don't know what the fixed costs are, and we're going to need to find those, but those are known as fixed costs because they don't change. It doesn't matter what the amount of sales are or the amount of variable costs, the fixed costs would remain the same. So we're going to figure out what those are. And in this case, we have an operating income of $36,208. If it was a loss, we would put it in parentheses to demonstrate that it's a negative number, but this is a positive amount. So the first thing we need to figure out is let's figure out our contribution margin. Let's figure out what this amount is. So as I mentioned, the contribution margin ratio is 32%. We're going to multiply that by the amount of sales. I'm going to use my handy BA2 Plus calculator. I like these. If you want to get your own, I've got a link down in the description where you can pick one up, or there's actually one on screen as well. So let's start with a $323,000, and we're going to multiply it by 32%, which I'm going to put in as 0.32, and that gives us a contribution margin of $103,360. That's how much of these sales that go toward our operating income. So now we know the contribution margin, we should be able to figure out the amount of the fixed costs, because contribution margin minus fixed costs is equal to our operating income. If we know this number and we know this number, we can find this number, right? So let me write that again down here. Our contribution margin minus our fixed costs is equal to our operating income. In this case, our contribution margin is 103,360. We don't know our fixed costs, so I'm going to leave that as that. And our operating income, we are told, is 36,208. So I can add fixed costs to both sides, and that leaves me 103,360 is equal to 36,208 plus fixed costs. I want to get fixed costs by itself, so I'm going to subtract 36,208 from both sides. That gives me fixed costs equal to, and I've got the 103,360 already on the screen. Just subtract out the 36,208, and that gives us 67,152. 67,152. That is our amount of fixed costs. Thank you for the thumbs up. That really helps with the channel. All right, so now we know the fixed costs and we know the amount of contribution margin. The only thing we need to figure out is what our variable costs are. Well, that's pretty simple. We've got sales, and our sales minus our variable costs is equal to our contribution margin. We know sales and we know the contribution margin. So if we subtract the contribution margin from the sales, that's going to give us our variable costs. Let me clear this out. Our sales are 323,000. And I subtract out my contribution margin that I used the contribution margin ratio to figure out. I subtract out the 103,360, and that gives me variable costs of 219,640. And that's how we fill in the first line across. Excellent. Let's go ahead and look at firm B. In this one, we are told we don't know what the sales are. We do know the variable costs. We don't know the contribution margin ratio, but we do know the fixed costs and the operating income. Since we know the fixed costs and the operating income, as we saw here, if we take our fixed costs and we add it, so in other words, if I've got contribution margin is equal to the subtracting fixed costs is equal to the operating income. If I take and add fixed costs to both sides, then my contribution margin is equal to operating income plus fixed costs. That's just algebra. So in our case, we've got fixed costs of 115,000, so 115,000. And if I add to that our operating income, in other words, we're going to combine these, add 71,566, that gives us 186,566. That is our contribution margin. Our contribution margin, and I'm just going to write it below here because we want the contribution margin ratio. So it's 186,566, but I want the ratio. So we need to figure out what that is. So to do that, I'm going to take and figure out what the sales are. So I've got the variable costs, and I'm going to add to that the contribution margin. If I do that, that's going to give me our sales, 186,566. And the reason I do that is the sales minus the variable costs gives us the contribution margin. So if I work in reverse, if I add contribution margin to the variable costs, that'll give me my sales. So I already have the contribution margin in here. I add it to the 461, and that gives me sales of 647,566. So we now know the amount of sales and we know the contribution margin, but we need to know the contribution margin ratio. And how do we do that? How do we find that? Well, we know that contribution margin ratio is going to be the contribution margin over the sales. So if I have 186,566 and I divide it by sales of 647,566, that's going to give me my ratio. So let's clear this out. I have 186,566. Let me put this where you can see it. I've got 186,566 and I divide it. That's my contribution margin. I divide it by the amount of sales, 647,566. That gives us a contribution margin of 0.29, which I'm going to multiply by 100 to get 29%. 29%. If you don't remember how to convert decimals to percentages, I've got a video linked up here in the corner to refresh your recollection on that. So now we filled out everything for firm B. The next step is firm C. We know the amount of sales. We don't know the variable costs. We do know the contribution margin ratio. We do know the amount of fixed costs, and we got to find the amount of operating income. So the first thing, let's find out what our actual contribution margin is. If I take the 126,000 of sales and I multiply that by the contribution margin ratio, which is 0.28, we're given that. That gives us an actual contribution margin of 35,280. So that's our contribution margin. If we take that and subtract it from the sales, that's going to back us into the variable costs. So I've got this on the computer or on the calculator already. I go ahead and turn it into a negative and I add the amount of sales to it, 126,000. That gives me 90,720. That's our amount of variable costs. Since we have contribution margin and we know the fixed costs, we can find the operating income. So I'm going to clear this out and put in our contribution margin, which is 35,280. I'm going to subtract from it the fixed cost of 39,400. And what do we expect? We expect a negative number, right? And we get one. That is I'm going to put in parentheses, $4,120 loss. So this one, our fixed costs are higher than we're making on our products. So we lost money in firm C. Let me clear this out. And we're going to do the last one, firm D. We don't know the sales. We do know the variable costs. We do know the contribution margin ratio. We don't know the fixed costs, but we do know the amount of operating income, or in this case, it's an operating loss. This one's a little trickier. Let's set this up. So we know that our contribution margin ratio, or at least our contribution margin, is going to be equal to our contribution margin ratio times our sales. We don't know what the sales are. So I'm going to call that X for right now. So our amount of sales is X. And I know that if I multiply sales by the contribution margin ratio, that's going to give me the contribution margin. So I'm going to write this here as 0.23 because that's my contribution margin ratio. I've converted it to a decimal, and if I multiply it by X, that's going to give us our contribution margin. That's going to be a dollar figure. So that's part of how we figure this out. The next step, though, we need to figure out what our contribution margin is in another way. And the other way we do it is we know that our sales, which again, we don't know what they are. I'm going to mark those as X. Our sales minus our variable costs, 57,000, is also equal to our contribution margin. So we can get to contribution margin two different ways, and I've set them both up algebraically. So to find X, to solve for X, all we need to do is set the contribution margin equal to itself, because we know contribution margin is equal to contribution margin, right? They're the same. In this case, we're finding the same contribution margin. We don't know what it is at the moment, but we do know that either way we find it, it comes to the same. And now let's substitute in. On one side, contribution margin is equal to 0.23x. And on the other side, contribution margin is equal to X minus 57,000. So now I've got an algebraic expression or equation. It's an equation, and I've got X on both sides. So I want to get the X's together, and I want to clean it up a little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 57,000 to both sides because I want to get a positive number here. So if I add it to both sides, I have 0.23x plus 57,000 is equal to x, right? This goes away. So on this side, I've got x, and I've got 0.23x plus 57,000. I want to get the x's on the same side. So I'm going to move this one over. I'm going to move this 0.23x over. And since it's a positive number, I'm going to subtract 0.23x. And if I do it to one side, I got to subtract the other side, 0.23x. This one goes away. So I've got 57,000 and then equals, and then I've got x. There's an invisible 1 here. So I've got 1, and I subtract 0.23 from it. That gives me 0.77x. So far, so good. I want to get the x by itself, so I divide both sides by 0.77. So my x is going to wind up equaling, I take 57,000 and I divide it by 0.77, and that gives me 74,025.97. That is our sales. So our sales is 74,025.97. That is the amount of sales. If I take that, got $74,025.97 is my sales. And if I've got a contribution margin, we got to figure out what that is. So if I've got this amount and I subtract out the 57,000, that is our variable cost, that leaves me a contribution margin of 17,025.97. That's the amount that's going toward our operating income or loss. I don't know the amount of the fixed cost, but I do know I've got this amount as a loss. Let's look at our formula again. Our contribution margin minus the fixed cost is equal to the operating income. So if I subtract out this, I don't know what this is. This is our fixed cost, equals this number here. To find it, all I need to do is add this number to that number to get our fixed costs. So I've got the $17,025.97. I'm going to add to it $4,930, and that gives me a fixed cost of $21,955.97. So if you take this contribution margin, subtract out fixed costs, which are higher than that, we wind up with a negative number of $4,930, approximately. There's some rounding there. That is how you fill in this chart. That's all I have for you today. I hope you found this helpful. If you would like to support the channel, it'd be great if you became a member. Members get special privileges like special members only video, early access to videos, and if you've got a question that you want converted into a video, those get higher priority. So consider becoming a member. Click the join button down below. Otherwise, you have no idea all the benefits you would get if you click the subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Now go and make it an awesome day. Thank you.